Now that we've looked at the outside of the Dome of the Rock, let's go inside and see how these characteristics are elements of the interior of the shrine. Now I put here together a view of the interior and then this diagram, the cross cutaway. So you can see the structure, how it relates to what we're going to look at inside. So we saw the exterior of the dome, the shape continuing on the inside, and it's lined by this extremely elaborate mosaic work, which we're going to look at. The dome rests on a series of stained glass windows, and then splaying out from the base of the dome, or the drum of the dome, we have two rows of interior columns. The first row of columns protect the sacred rock. The second row of columns creates this aisle that we're going to look at, this double aisle that we're going to look at in more detail. The interior is just as splendidly decorated as the exterior. We have this marble veneer. So a veneer are thin slabs of material that line a wall or a surface. So here, these are thin slabs of marble. And the way that you get these types of patterns is you would take the veined marble and cut it into pieces, and then the arrangement of those pieces can create these echoing effects of diamonds and ripples. And it creates this gorgeous, dazzling surface, which is characteristic of the Islamic architecture, right? We know then to decorate surfaces with these complex patterns. And these complex patterns just happen to be made with the natural veining of the marble. So the veined marble lines the exterior, or the interior walls up to a certain point, and then the top register of the wall, and then continuing up into the ceiling, is done in mosaic tile. This type of interior with marble veneer and then mosaic ceiling is something you see in Byzantine architecture. It's a very common interior decoration of Byzantine palaces and Byzantine churches. So when we see it here at the Dome of the Rock, it shouldn't be a surprise because, well, Islam is coming into the territory of the Byzantine Empire, and they see it, they experience, they live it. Also, Byzantine Christianity is seen as then extending into the Islamic faith. So it's not seen as sacrilegious to continue with that kind of sacred architecture of the marble and the mosaic. In fact, they hired Byzantine artists to come down to Jerusalem to do this mosaic tile work, because at this time, the Byzantine mosaic artists were the best of the best. So yeah, you want to hire the best for your shrine. You're going to hire a Byzantine artist. So here we see a blending of the Byzantine Empire and this blossoming Islamic empire, and a blending of the Christian sacred architecture continuing through into Islamic sacred architecture. Let's get some more views here. We are looking up from one of the aisleways. These bi-colored arches, we saw those in the Great Mosque at Cordoba. This is another characteristic of Islamic architecture, and it adds this beautiful visual effect. Let me just here. So here we are standing at the edge looking into the sacred rock that is protected by the dome. And remember what we said about how the dome is symbolic of heaven. Here, this beautiful gold and glass mosaic dome is speaking to the splendor of Allah, of God, and it is heaven. it is from this rock that the Prophet Muhammad had a view, a vision of heaven. So we see this blending of the Prophet's vision with that dome of heaven. And then the windows that go around the dome at the base, that is another characteristic of Byzantine church architecture. It's extremely popular. And what it does is it creates this almost weightless visual effect, or how would I say it? It's as if the weight of the dome is, okay, let me reframe again. The windows, glass, it doesn't hold a lot of weight before it shatters. And yet, this massive dome is resting on these windows. How is that possible? It's a visual effect that creates a sense of God's presence, that this heavenly dome is being held up by God himself. In fact, that is why these were so popular in Byzantine architecture. It was said that God held the dome from a golden string from heaven above. So here, in this shrine, we see that continuing through this floating sphere, or this floating dome of heaven, right? Resting on these gorgeous, brightly colored stained glass windows and protecting the rock. Oh, back to those bicolored arches. So you see how it creates this kind of striped pattern. But what that striped pattern also does is it helps your eye move up and around the space. It gives your eye some kind of resting points. Dot, 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 and it keeps you moving through the space in regular intervals. So it's a decorative pattern for the eye to move through this splendor. Here, the detail of the mosaic tile work. It's very similar to what we saw in the Mosque of Damascus, where we have the fruited palms of heaven, the promise of heaven. Also notice how the background is gold. So it's the golden light of heaven. This is not supposed to be a fruited palm out and about in your regular world, because that sky is blue. This sky is gold. So when you see the gold behind these types of elements, it is meant to show you a vision of the golden light of heaven. And this is an otherworldly view. This is not of earth. That would be blue sky. This is gold sky. So we have this promise of heaven. We have the dome of heaven. We have the rock in which Muhammad visited heaven. And then if we look into the dome, we have this amazing display of geometry. So this is characteristic of Islamic architecture, that play of geometry, of math, and then that repetition of form across a surface. It is speaking to the complexity of God, of Allah. His infinite knowledge, his infinite wisdom is being displayed within this magic of math. And our human minds can only understand and process so much of that complexity. And so we're seeing this array of heavenly bodies of math as understood only by Allah. Oh, wow. I love this detail here because not only do you see the promise of, the fruits and vegetation of heaven, but I want you to recognize, or I want you to notice these geometric patterns and rosettes, because these are elements that we see in Persian art. Persia, which is to the east of Jerusalem, to the east of this blossoming Islamic civilization. In Persia, we have this type of pattern work that we see in a lot of their textiles and carpets, right? So we see a blending of the Byzantine Christian world from the northwest of Jerusalem, and we see a blend of the more farther eastern Persian Empire within this mosaic decorative tile work. Here we are looking down at the rock. And these columns here are defining the sacred space, holding up the dome, and they mark where you're not allowed to walk, and they give you the space where you are allowed to walk. In architecture, this type of space is referred to as an ambulatory, and this is your vocabulary word. It's one of my favorite words, honestly. Ambulatory, a ring-like vaulted corridor separating an interior from a sacred space or altar. So the sacred space is the rock, and we don't want you to walk across it, and so the ring corridor is where you will amble about. Do you hear it in the term ambulatory? To amble is to casually walk. So the ambulatory is saying you amble around the space. Don't amble through the sacred space. You amble around it, the ambulatory. And this one has two ambulatories because the columns here create an interior or an inner ambulatory and an outer ambulatory. So here we are standing in the outer ambulatory, and you can see the inner ambulatory. Now the mosaics that I showed you, we saw those fruited palms and those grape leaves. There are also mosaics of crowns and chalices, royal objects that would have then associated this sacred rock and the Prophet Muhammad as rulers, right? The dominance of the Islamic faith, the presence of it in Jerusalem, but also the expansion of the empire under the caliphs. So there are crowns and chalices, not figures, right? They're not humans, they're not animals, so it's not sacrilegious. Instead, those objects are representations of Islam's larger power and control or rule over people. Let's continue. I love this view because you can see the complex geometric pattern and that repetition. So write that down. Characteristic of Islamic architecture will be that geometric pattern play on the surface of the architecture, the walls, the ceilings, the archways, and that repetition of pattern. It's not just once, but it continues over and over and over. Beautiful, beautiful.